Last week, we learned that the flood was sent to save the creation and wipe out the Nephilim corruption from the earth. And we saw that the phrase Noah was perfect in his generations was referring to Noah's uncorrupted lineage to Adam that was detailed in chapter 5 of Genesis. And this week, as we continue to explain more seeming genocide in the Bible, we will be focused on the time period after the flood to see how Satan continued his attempts to stop the seed of the woman from coming. In Genesis 6, when discussing the Nephilim, the Bible tells us that they were on earth in those days before the flood and also afterwards. This can be easy to miss, but if we search out the word Nephilim, we find them again in the book of Numbers, just as Genesis indicated. In the book of Numbers, the same exact Hebrew word is used when the spies came back from surveying the promised land. The 10 doubting spies gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, or Nephilim, the descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." So the Nephilim were present in Genesis 6 and in Numbers chapter 13. And both of these passages set the stage for what is commonly thought of as genocide in the Bible. Notice here that the spies described the Nephilim as men of great stature, and they even went as far to say that they were like grasshoppers compared to them. This biblical description of the Nephilim is why many translators have called them giants, and they replace the word Nephilim with the word for giants very frequently. This is probably not the best or most accurate way to translate these passages, because in both areas where the Nephilim are discussed, other plain words are given to describe them as giants. But the word Nephilim is actually describing them as fallen ones. So literally, the passages should either be transliterated as Nephilim or translated as the fallen ones. But calling them giants is redundant, and it obscures the fact that the Bible's describing more about them than just how big they are. These beings are actually fallen from birth and unredeemable, just as we learned last week, because they are the unholy offspring of angelic and human crossbreeding. This means that regardless of their size, they are fallen and condemned as a violation of God's creation. And that is all wrapped up in their proper classification as Nephilim. Then after the Bible clearly describes their origins and status with God as fallen, then in these two critical passages, their physical description is given. These beings were definitely describable as giants. They were mighty or powerful. They were well known in the ancient world, and they filled the promised land as men of great stature, and they made the spies feel like grasshoppers or locusts by comparison. Also, with these two passages, we can begin to see even more detail about the lineage of the Nephilim. Not only did they come from the forbidden union of the fallen angels and human women, but later one of the Nephilim, specifically named Anak, had offspring. We will see later that the offspring of Anak, who are described here as men of great stature or height, were called the Anakim. This lineage will be important to tracing all of the fallen offspring of the Nephilim, like the Anakim, throughout the Old Testament. For example, in Deuteronomy, when recounting the spies' report, the sons of the Anakim are described as much bigger and taller than the Israelites, and their cities were fortified up to heaven, meaning they had gigantic walls. From archaeological evidence and the biblical account, It seems like this description of the walls fits very well with the city of Jericho, for example, because its walls pictured here were truly massive. And the people of the promised land, such as Jericho, are described here as the Anakim, which were the descendants of the Nephilim. So the thread of the Nephilim leads us to the land of promise known as Canaan, and following the thread requires that we look for the descendants of the Nephilim and their various names, such as the Anakim. If we carefully trace the names and lineage of the Nephilim, we can then understand each case of supposed genocide in the Bible. And the conquest of these nations will also be a clear case of deliverance and protection of the human race, not a cruel act of indifference. And while we trace out the thread of the Nephilim seed, we must not forget the prophecy that started this entire genetic battle with Satan. Remember that God said the seed of the woman would bruise the serpent's head? We've already seen that the first incursion before the flood of these fallen angels and their offspring, the Nephilim, logically appears to be an attempt to stop this prophecy from being fulfilled. But how would a race of Nephilim offspring in the promised land play into this battle also? God promised Abraham several things, and in these promises, a narrowing of the line of the seed was given. God chose Abraham to be part of the lineage of the promised seed. And Paul later makes it very clear that this seed was the Messiah, or Christ in Greek. Satan knew this, and he also knew that God had told Abraham exactly where on planet Earth the nation he would father was going to inherit. God had clearly promised Abraham the land of Canaan, and that is why it's called the Promised Land. The Promised Land is what the spies were sent into to check out over 400 years later. And that is where they found that all the people in it were of great stature. Satan had heard another prophecy related to the seed and paid close attention to it, it seems. Satan knew that he could focus his attention on the narrow area of land we now call Israel to try to prevent God from fulfilling his promise to Abraham. And that second seed prophecy is what brings us to this chapter in Numbers. The second mention of the Nephilim was the second battle in Satan's war against the coming seed. But once again, it would fail like the first one did. In the Old Testament, Satan was focused on preventing the seed from coming. And even up to the actual birth of the seed, Satan was trying to wipe out all potential candidates. He used people like Pharaoh in Egypt, Haman in the book of Esther, and Herod in the Gospels to try to destroy the seed. But once the seed came and Satan's head was bruised at the cross, his focus shifted towards distraction and misinformation. That means now we are in the time of the new covenant. Satan's focus is all about keeping people away from the good news about the victory of the seed. But back in the days of these spies, who were sent to investigate the promised land ahead of Israel, Satan's attacks were still focused on preventing the seed from coming and causing God's promises to fail. So he was busy behind the scenes, filling the promised land with people of great stature. Sadly, Satan caused 10 out of the 12 spies to fear these giants more than they feared God. All of the spies who returned from this reconnaissance mission, except for 2, Joshua and Caleb, were too terrified to face these giant offspring of the Nephilim, and they gave Israel this bad report. One of the things that their report included was the fact that the promised land was a land that devours its inhabitants. But they also carried back a single cluster of grapes that was so large and so heavy they had to carry it between 2 of them on a pole. Obviously, the land didn't devour its inhabitants by famine or want. There must have been a very different type of devouring going on here. Remember last week we saw in the apocryphal book of Enoch, which Jude directly quotes from, that the Nephilim were devouring mankind? This is very reminiscent of the passage in Numbers where the spies were describing what they saw. If we consider all the possible interpretations for the phrase, a land that devours its inhabitants, and we consider that the spies recounted they were like grasshoppers in comparison to these giants, the only logical explanation available directly lines up with these passages in Enoch. The giants they saw must have turned against mankind to devour them. There's no logically consistent alternative to this interpretation of this part of their report. It seems obvious to many who study this passage that the people of great stature being described were also involved in cannibalism. So we can see why 10 of these spies were terrified to take on the promised land. The land was full of people of great stature who made them feel like grasshoppers, and they were also probably involved in the eating of the offspring of Adam. This report made many want to turn back to Egypt, but Joshua and Caleb gave a good report and correctly instructed the people that they should not fear these giant people of the promised land because the Lord was with them. Sadly, the people did not listen, and they feared the Anakim more than they trusted God. So God judged that generation. And from Israel, all of those who were 20 and older, except for Joshua and Caleb, were not allowed to enter the promised land. They all died in the wilderness for their lack of faith. God had proven himself over and over, from the plagues to the Red Sea, but they never learned to obediently trust him. So in Deuteronomy, after the doubting generation had died, Moses recounted the law and all that Israel had been through so far. And then he gave the next generation instructions about dealing with the second Nephilim incursion. He said, "Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today and go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than yourself. Cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim, whom you know and of whom you've heard it said, who can stand before the descendants of Anak? Therefore, understand today that the Lord your God is he who goes over before you as a consuming fire. He will destroy them and bring them down before you. So you shall drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the Lord has said to you." God commanded the swift destruction of these Anakim, clearly because they were the descendants of the Nephilim. And just as before, they are all described as tall and mighty. The spies were correct about their description of these individuals, but they made the mistake of doubting God's promises that guaranteed he would give them total victory over these fallen hybrids. God had promised them the land, and all they had to do was believe and obey him to win the victory. So here Moses is instructing the next generation to do what their elders and fathers failed to do before them. And Moses, as well as the report in Numbers chapter 13, makes it clear that some of the offspring of the Nephilim were called the Anakim. This means that Nephilim can reproduce, and their offspring have many similar characteristics that make them physically distinct, like being extremely strong and large. And Deuteronomy chapter 2 also gives us another name to follow, as it mentions the Zamzummim. These were also a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim, and the Lord destroyed them as he did the rest of the giants. And another group that seems to be the offspring of the Nephilim was the Emim. We can read that the Emim were a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim, and they were also regarded as giants like the Anakim. And this passage also gives us another line that proceeded from the Nephilim, and that is called the Rephaim. Notice how all these names share the same ending in our transliterated form. That's because they all spring from the same source. And in Genesis 14, amidst two already established Nephilim offspring names, we also see the Zuzim. So we can deduce that they are another line of fallen offspring. Then back in Deuteronomy 2 again, we see another group called the Avim. Clearly, the world of ancient Israel was full of these beings, and some of them will be described and named as we continue. But it's important to familiarize ourselves with the Nephilim family tree so that when we hear these names, we can recognize the fallen giant nature of the individuals being mentioned. And whatever we apply to one of these descendants of the Nephilim, we can apply to all, since they're all branches on the same corrupted tree. Interestingly, if we name the types of angels we're aware of, the angel categories are very similar to the names of the Nephilim offspring. There are cherubim and seraphim angels, and these offspring of the fallen angels are called the Nephilim, Anakim, Amim, Zamzumim, Rephaim, Zuzim, and Avim. This is a helpful clue to spotting the descendants of the Nephilim in the Old Testament. And another interesting thing can be noticed when we look for these Nephilim offspring names in the Hebrew. A literal interpretation of Isaiah 26:14 says, "Dead ones do not live, Rephaim do not rise. Because of this you visited and destroyed them, and caused all memory of them to perish." This passage, written after the conquest against the Nephilim, was remembering that the Rephaim were destroyed and all memory of them had perished. And interestingly, the prophet also mentions that the Rephaim do not rise. Jesus is clear that all who are in the graves will rise at some point. But it's clear from this passage that the Rephaim will not rise. All of mankind will be resurrected to either death or life, depending on their relationship with God through Jesus Christ. So when Jesus returns, the saints will be resurrected first, and later at the end of his 1,000-year reign, we call the millennium, the rest of the dead will stand before him to be judged. This is what will happen to the sons of Adam, but these Rephaim will not rise at either time, because they're an abomination created by the fallen angels, and their judgment was sealed the day their parents sinned. So when we study the Old Testament, we should always take notice if we see one of these specific names to help us identify the Nephilim offspring. And we can also be looking for a description that portrays a giant. In this passage, for example, we see the connection in genetic lineage between the Nephilim and the descendants of Anak, who were also called the Anakim. And these names tell us who we are dealing with, and we can also see that a physical description that portrays a being of great size and strength. So this also indicates a descendant of the fallen ones. The Bible took the time to describe how these descendants of the Nephilim came into being in Genesis 6, and how prevalent they were, and then it connected a description of them so that we could recognize them without a specific Nephilim name. Then we must use the background to inform other verses, such as Amos 2:9. As we can see, no Nephilim offspring names are used here, but God says, "It was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath." Here we see a cedar of Lebanon compared to an average-sized man. And God himself said that the Amorites were a people whose height was comparable to the cedar's height. He also mentions that he destroyed the fruits and the roots of these people. This is once again a genetic phrase meaning the father of the Amorites and all of his offspring also. We can see why the spies who went into the nations of Canaan said that they looked like grasshoppers compared to the nations that once lived there. And here is where we must transition from the Nephilim names and the clear description of their offspring to the nations, like the Amorites, who the spies said were the giant descendants of the Nephilim. Prior to Israelites entering the land, God told them to spare all other nations, but these specific ones: the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and the Perizzites. And we just saw that the Amorites were a people whose height was comparable to the cedar's height. So we know they were the descendants of the Nephilim, but how about all these other nations? Well, these other nations were the same ones that the spies reported back on, saying they were the descendants of Anak and fierce. This is a description of the nations that God said to destroy completely. The spies reported that all the people they saw in the land were men of great stature, and it was a land that was eating up those who lived in it. Obviously, the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the other nations God mentioned were the nations that the spies saw, and the nations that God commanded them to wipe out completely. And they were all descendants of the Nephilim in some way or another. The Nephilim names like Anakim, Rephaim, or Amim describe the lineage and genealogy of an individual or group. But the other names, like Amalekites, Amorites, or Canaanite, describe the Nephilim-infected nations. Because of the Numbers 13 report, Amos chapter 2, and later even descriptions of some of the Philistines, we know that the nations of the Promised Land during this period in history were infected with Nephilim DNA. And these corrupted nations were exactly who God commanded they wipe out completely. With that background, we're ready to start to look at the conquest of the land of Canaan that really began with Moses on the far side of the Jordan River. In order to show Joshua that God would defeat the giants and put the fear of God into those corrupted nations in the Promised Land, God defeated two of the kings of the Amorites through Moses. Under his leadership, the first two kings to be defeated were Sihon and Og. After the defeat of these two kings, when Rahab described how the people of the land were in fear of the Israelites, she said that they were afraid for two reasons. First, because they heard that God had parted the Red Sea for them, and Israel passed through it on dry land. And second, because they heard of their victory over these two kings. There is a very big reason these two events were so impressive. Obviously, the Red Sea crossing was absolutely amazing. But what was so special about Israel's defeating these two kings, Sihon and Og? There is some detailed information provided about Og that explains why the people were so afraid of Israel after they defeated him and Sihon. The Bible says that Og, the king of Bashan, was all that was left of the remnant of the Rephaim, one of the direct descendants of the Nephilim. This may mean that Og was the last Rephaim on that side of the Jordan, or the last known Rephaim in the first generation, but Og was definitely of the Rephaim line and also an Amorite king. He is described as having a bed of iron that was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, according to the cubit of a man. Some believe this is describing his coffin, and others believe this is describing his bed as we would know it. But the size of his bed is important for understanding the size of Og. The cubit is a measurement of the span from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. But unfortunately, that's different for every person, and many different cubits have been used by different cultures throughout history. For example, my personal cubit is 19 inches, but that's not a standard cubit for anyone but me. To solve the problem of which cubit is being used here, we need to think biblically. Stephen, as well as logic, tells us that the cubit being referred to here would have to be an Egyptian cubit, since Moses was trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and the nation of Israel had been slaves there for 400 years. In ancient Egypt, cubit rods were used like a ruler for the measurement of length, and archaeologists have even located a few of these ancient rulers over the years. 14 of them were compared, and the Egyptian cubit they were based on ranges from 20.6 to 20.8 inches in length. These were known as the Egyptian royal cubit. And the low end of this range was even used to produce the Great Pyramid in Giza. Despite this good evidence, some scholars debate that the Israelite cubit could be from 18.9 to 22.7 inches. So there's no real consensus today. But logically, since Moses and the people would have had strong Egyptian influences, and the royal cubit of 20.6 inches was so common, as the Great Pyramid reveals, it seems that the Egyptian royal cubit is a good middle ground. So, using the Egyptian royal cubit of 20.6 inches, the bed of Og, the king of Bashan, was 185.4 inches, or 15.45 feet. Compare that to a king-size bed today that's only 80 inches long. And we see that Og was a very big fellow. So let's give Og a little breathing room on his giant iron bed and estimate his height based on this passage. We'll say that the average person is around 6 feet tall, and they have an extra 6 inches or so on their normal king-size bed. But we'll give even more space to Og and take just under a foot away from his bed length to estimate his size. That would make Og around 14.5 feet tall. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Og, the king of Bashan. Based on the royal Egyptian cubit and a generous reduction from the size of his bed, Og was somewhere around 14.5 feet tall. And here he is next to a 6-foot man. This is why the whole ancient world was talking about Israel defeating Og and Sihon. They were descendants of the Nephilim, and Og was one of the last of the line of the Rephaim. Also, consider that a strong 6-foot man needs to consume around 2,500 calories a day to maintain an active warrior lifestyle. So what kind of calories would someone like Og need to consume? Og may have weighed somewhere around 2,500 pounds, and he would have needed an extraordinary amount of calories to survive. Estimates on his size and weight put his required calories at around 21,000 calories per day. Remember, the spies said that the land of Canaan was a land that devoured its inhabitants? Beings like Og are most likely the reason they said that. Og would have needed around 82 hamburgers per day to survive. Certainly, he wouldn't have had time to feed, slaughter, butcher, and prepare all of that food for himself. And remember, he's an enormous person compared to the grasshoppers around him. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to conclude that someone this big would have had at least resorted to enslaving the surrounding human population. So at best, the humans would have been charged with feeding him. But if they failed, sadly, the Bible seems clear, then they were on his menu. This giant named Og is one of the Amorite kings that Israel destroyed completely. And the Bible is clear that Og came from the line of the Nephilim as a Rephaim, and he was one of the kings of the Amorite people in the city of Bashan. And just like the flood completely wiped out the Nephilim before, Israel utterly destroyed this hybrid king and Sihon also. God even explains in Amos, as we already saw, that the Amorites were as tall as the cedars, but he destroyed their roots and their fruit completely. This destruction of Og and Sihon of the Amorites was the beginning of God's cleansing of the land. Moses led these first campaigns on the far side of the Jordan before they crossed over, so the people would know that they could follow Joshua into battle against these giants and win. They had to learn that because the Lord went before them, he would give them the victory. And after the flood, these pre-Jordan crossing wars were the next case of supposed genocide in the Bible. And with the actual background and history of the Amorites and the Nephilim issue clearly understood, we can actually understand why the Bible records this next difficult verse. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, Moses said, "We took all of Sihon's cities at that time, and we utterly destroyed the men, women, and little ones of every city. We left none remaining. When we look at the scriptures in their proper context, we see that these children, as the offspring of the Nephilim, were doomed by the very act that created them. The fallen angels had corrupted the DNA of the human race, and these children were the condemned result of their sin. If they were allowed to remain, more lives would be infected with the genetic corruption of those sinning angels, and the problem would have spread. As we saw earlier, the descendants of the Nephilim do not rise. And if their seed was allowed to continue in the world, all of humanity could have been lost. So this time, instead of a flood, God used Israel and even a few other nations to destroy the seed of the fallen angels from the earth again. And that's what Deuteronomy is describing. When we pick up next week, we'll see how Joshua carried on the cleansing after Moses left off, as the Israelites crossed over the Jordan to reclaim the promised land for Adam's offspring. And we will see that under Joshua, nearly all of the corrupted seed of the Nephilim was destroyed, except for one particular nation. That nation then became a thorn in the side of Israel, and the most famous giant in the Bible, though definitely not the largest, fought on the side of this last recorded Nephilim nation, only to be defeated by a young shepherd boy.